Subjugation is a subordinating and is highly associated with codependency. Subjugation is also associated with presumptuousness. If you are presuming to subjugate someone else, in other words, that you believe that you have a higher status than another person has. We tend towards these maladjusted coping modes because we were exposed to them. In other words, we learned to behave that way by degree. And if we were, for example, raised in a subordinating or subjugated family setting, we become much more prone to do it in our own lives. So what does that mean? Well, I think one of the easiest ways to understand that is the idea of mutual respect. Sometimes youngsters are not respected sufficiently by their parents. It could be ignorance. In other words, the parent presumes that the child is to be subordinated, and there is an issue of power that comes into the that recurrently comes into the relationship. So, of course, indeed, the parent is in charge, and the child must certainly learn that and begin to defer to the parent. However, a parent can be actually afraid of losing control and be overly preoccupied with subordinating the child. So the most important idea that has to do with the recovery from subjugation schema is, if you will, respect, and that is that the child needs to be respected, or needed to be respected, and we need to awaken to that. What does that mean exactly as far as a parent? That means when you speak to your child, you are respectful of their grasp of their circumstances and perhaps the limitations, and you provide them the necessary time to help them understand. Sometimes parents are too quick. If they come from a culture where there's a lot of punitiveness, they're too quick to become punitive to begin to control the situation rather than using language. So if you grew up in a setting where, for example, a parent was subordinated by another parent, for example, in many homes and cultures, the male presumes to subordinate the female members of the family, and it could begin with the mother being subordinated to the father, and that again is being taught. So though the roles may be different, we need to awaken to the fact that all roles are essential, and that there is a horizontal value in each member of the family. In other words, each person is essential for the operation of the family. And so too our subordination occurs with children. For example, it is quite pervasive that the idea that the women in the family, or the girls in the family, do not move to leadership roles. So in other words, leadership is not prescribed. It is a presumed subordination, and the girls in the family are taught not to aspire to positions of leadership. So that is a subjugating environment, and you can see that it can be quite insidious. People learn to behave that way. They operate from deep-seated presumptions. They presume to take on particular roles because the traditions have taught them to do that. However, in the equity of nature, these roles are actually horizontal, and subjugation, even when it is culturally sanctioned, is still a form of suffering. It's a form of pathology. In other words, entire culture can be enduring that pathology and ultimately have the negative outcomes that come from that pathology. There then is a problem of insight. In other words, the culture will have negative outcomes from that presumptuous behavior. And what type of negative outcomes? Well, if you have a presumptuous the presumption that males are, for example, more important than the female, you will have tendencies to see that behavior acted out in the young people, and there may be more inappropriate sexual activities subordinating women, or there may be violence towards women as youngsters, and of course violence towards women as adults in the culture itself. I think we all see that in our current culture. I actually do recall an episode some years back in which a group of young people decided to take the brassieres off young women, and a police officer was alerted, and the police officer did not respond. And this may be attributable to underlying assumptions about the privileges that a male may have, and in other words, that this is somehow acceptable, and we rationally recognize that it is not. However, when we carry these assumptions, they are presumptions, in our minds, we're often not aware of them, and though we will express ourselves as being concerned about equity and the equality between men and women, we actually are not operating on that system. We actually have to work our way out of that into a new perspective. So the problem about subordination and being subjugated is that it is indeed codependent. When a child is exposed to being subjugated, she or he begins to worry, begins to talk to herself, and becomes distracted. In other words, something is wrong, and the parents are not necessarily aware of it. So you're getting an unsupported child, and the ideas of being power differentials and being subordinated, unfairness enters the mind of the young people, issues of unfairness, and they begin to think about this quite a lot and have fantasies about it. It can become a preoccupation, and it can distract the youngster from being present. And what we recognize as being present is a critical sign of good health. In other words, it is an indicator of that there are not too many internal distractions, that the person is able to be present, to learn, to be interested in this current experience. And the worried child has a problem with that, in that the child now has representations. They are actually processing their concerns, their their worldview and their self-conception becomes a problem, and they become somewhat distracted from the current moment. So, things, education, for example, learning can be impaired by degree, and of course also some acting out behaviors because the problem is not understood, and it finds expression in these excessive acts, regrettable acts. There's some repression, and then an unwanted behavior can occur. And ironically, the parent and the teacher will ask, "What's wrong with you?" And the child really does not know what's wrong with them. Ironically, the parent who has actually created the problem will have an attribution error, believing that the problem, the source of the problem is the child, not realizing that it is in the system or in themselves. So this is the insidious nature of a subjugation schema. It is not quite equivalent to abuse, which is another form of subjugation, no doubt about it. Here, the parent generally controls the child by being unpleasant or withdrawing affection, that type of behavior. Still very disturbing, and also, if I may, it is codependent. It is codependent. In other words, it is a contract that is not healthy. It wants the child to be subordinated, and then you will have, if the subordinator then believes that they will provide for that subordinated person, and they'll have an operating system. So again, it looks like it works sometimes. However, it does not work as effectively as a relationship that is based on mutual respect, where all members of the family have their roles, and undoubtedly some of them are providers, others are sustainers, and of course others receive the sustenance. However, all these roles are critical to the health and perpetuation of life. So we're talking today about the subjugation schema, and I think what is important about the recovery from subjugation is to understand its close relationship to codependency. Codependency is not minding your own business. Again, I'll say it. Codependency is not minding your own business. It's not looking over at somebody's newspaper and reading their paper, but it is a preoccupation with relationships and in your imagination. So the person who is codependent is essentially codependent in their imagination first, in their behavior second. So what we do in our recovery is that we begin to take our attention off the folks around us. Generally, it's in the primary relationships. That means our significant others, our children. Of course, we need to be thinking about these people. However, controlling them is what we look for, and we begin to interrupt that. We allow life to organize us rather than our fears, and that is the recovery process. So subjugation produces worry. Worry is a form of fear. We are concerned about who we are and what the nature of the world is. When we get older, that continues, and we begin to look for fear-driven ideas in our mind's eye and in our imagination, in our self-talk and in our fantasizing. And we begin to make changes there. Importantly, folks, we need to be practicing, to some extent, contemplative practices where we still our minds and begin to observe what our minds are doing. In other words, awareness becomes aware of the mind, what it's delivering into our consciousness, so to speak. So we're differentiating ourselves from the ideas that are being constructed by the mind.